In today's episode, we explore 3 horrifying encounters with some of the world's most feared reptiles. From a snake expert who thought he was untouchable until one venomous bite proved him wrong, to an innocent teenage girl whose split-second panic turned a survivable attack into a tragic death. But first, we begin with a case so bizarre it left an entire police department stunned. A house filled with 200 deadly reptiles, a toddler sitting feet away from one of the world's most venomous snakes, and a man mysteriously dead on his living room floor. Wade Westbrook didn't just love snakes, he lived for them. A lifelong passion that shaped his identity, earning him a reputation as the expert in East Ridge, Tennessee. If you had a snake problem, Wade was your first call. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his enthusiasm infectious, and his confidence in handling even the most dangerous of serpents was unmatched. But on the night of January 29, 2011, Wade's expertise failed him in the most devastating way possible. A simple favor, a routine identification, a snake that should have been harmless until it wasn't. What followed was a tragic sequence of events where hesitation and fear turned a survivable bite into a death sentence. By 2011, Tennessee had recorded an average of 150 venomous snake bites annually, with copperheads accounting for nearly 85% of all reported cases. Despite these numbers, fatalities remained rare. Less than 0.1% of copperhead bites resulted in death. The state's emergency response protocol for snake bites had been refined over decades, with specialized anti-venom units stationed at major hospitals. Yet these statistics assumed immediate medical intervention, a luxury Wade wouldn't receive. This is the story of how the man who had spent his entire life mastering snakes was killed by one. For as long as anyone could remember, Wade was the go-to guy for all things reptilian. At just 26 years old, he had built a reputation far beyond his years, amassing an unparalleled knowledge of Tennessee's native snake population. He was the kind of person who saw beauty where others saw danger, who found wonder in creatures most people feared, even copperheads. Copperheads represent nature's perfect ambush predator. Their strike speed averages 2.98 meters per second, faster than a human can blink. Their heat-sensing pits can detect temperature variations of 0.002 degrees Celsius, allowing them to track prey with microscopic precision. Most importantly, their venom, a complex cocktail of hemotoxins and cytotoxins, begins destroying tissue within minutes of injection. Unlike other pit vipers, copperheads can control their venom output, often delivering warning bites with minimal venom. But when threatened, they can inject up to 150 milligrams of venom, enough to kill small prey instantly. Wade's home on Blandon Drive was more than just a house, it was a private zoo filled with terrariums and enclosures housing an impressive collection of snakes. Many were legal, but some were not. Tennessee law strictly prohibited the possession of native venomous species in captivity without permits. Even transporting such a snake required extensive paperwork, background checks, and strict safety measures. Wade had none of these. Tennessee's exotic animal laws ranked among America's strictest. By 2011, keeping venomous snakes required a $1,000 annual permit, monthly facility inspections, and proof of $100,000 in liability insurance. Yet the black market thrived. Wildlife officials estimated over 10,000 illegal venomous snakes were kept in Tennessee basements and bedrooms. The previous year alone saw 27 arrests for illegal possession, though experts believed this represented less than 1% of actual violations. But Wade was careful, and everyone knew he had a few venomous creatures hidden away. He had always been one step ahead of the authorities, keeping his collection discreet, ensuring that the wrong eyes never saw what he had behind closed doors. And yet, despite his illegal activities, he had never been in serious trouble. His love for snakes was pure, and in a way, the community respected that. They turned a blind eye because at the end of the day, Wade wasn't just some reckless collector. He was an expert. He knew how to handle them, how to care for them, how to avoid danger. Or so everyone thought. It was a quiet Saturday evening and Wade was at home enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. But peace never lasted long in his world. At 8 p.m. his phone rang. On the other end of the line was a friend, frantic and desperate. He had found a snake in his backyard and needed Wade's expertise. Could he identify it? Was it dangerous? Wade didn't hesitate. He never did. He told his friend to bring the snake over, confident that whatever it was, he could handle it. When his friend arrived, he carried a makeshift enclosure, a plastic container hastily put together holding the writhing creature inside. Wade peered in and immediately knew what he was dealing with. A copperhead. Common, familiar. A snake Wade had encountered dozens of times before. Copperheads were one of the most recognizable venomous snakes in North America. With their distinctive tan bodies, dark hourglass-shaped crossbands, and copper-colored heads, they were easy to identify. And yet, something about this one was off. It was January. Copperheads were supposed to be hibernating this time of year. Why wasn't this one? As Wade studied it, a theory formed in his mind. It was possible that this particular snake had been born late in the season, too small to properly hibernate, too weak to follow its instincts. Or maybe, just maybe, it had once belonged to a collector, someone who had raised it in captivity before releasing it into the wild. But before he could voice his suspicions, his friend interrupted. "Can you tell if it's male or female?" It was an innocent question, a simple request. One Wade had answered countless times before. Without a second thought, he reached into the enclosure and carefully lifted the snake into his hands. And in that moment, his fate was sealed. The strike was so fast, so precise, that Wade barely had time to react. The copperhead's fangs sank deep into the flesh just above his elbow. A perfect hit. For a split second, there was silence. Then reality crashed in. Wade sucked in a sharp breath, his eyes widening as pain flared through his arm. His friend took a step back, panic rising. Wade, though visibly shaken, tried to stay calm. He had been bitten before. He knew the steps to take. Quickly, he placed the snake back into its enclosure, his hands already trembling. The puncture wounds were beginning to swell. He could feel the venom spreading, coursing through his bloodstream. He tried to extract it, pressing his lips against the wound, attempting to suck out the toxin. Nothing. The venom had already moved too deep. Desperate, he grabbed a syringe, preparing to inject himself with a DIY antivenom. A risky, self-administered solution that had saved him in the past. But this time, it failed. His breathing became labored, his vision blurred, he swayed on his feet. For the first time in his life, Wade knew he was in real danger. "Call 911, he whispered, his voice was weak, his strength fading. Then he collapsed onto the couch, and everything went black. His friend stood frozen. If he called for help, paramedics would come, and if paramedics came, they would see. The illegal snakes, the venomous species Wade had been keeping in secret. The entire collection that shouldn't have been there. Fear clouded his judgment. Instead of dialing 911, he grabbed his phone and called a few of Wade's other friends. Within minutes, they arrived, not to help Wade, but to clear out his collection. They moved quickly, removing the evidence, making sure that when authorities arrived, there would be no venomous snakes left to find. 10 minutes. That's how long it took before someone finally made the call. By then, Wade's body was shutting down. When paramedics arrived, they found him unconscious, his pulse faint. CPR was performed immediately, and he was rushed to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga. But it was too late. At 26 years old, Wade Westbrook was pronounced dead. Copperhead bites are rarely fatal, but Wade's history of past envenomations may have triggered an allergic reaction, causing his body to go into shock at an accelerated rate. Herpetologist Courtney Lewis later explained, "It depends on where you're bitten and how much venom was injected, but in the end, it's always best to get to the hospital as quickly as possible." That was the tragedy. Had his friend called for help immediately, Wade would have survived. Instead, fear of exposure cost him his life. A man who had dedicated his existence to snakes was abandoned when he needed saving the most. But Wade wasn't the only one to suffer a devastating fate at the hands of a venomous serpent. That same year, across the state of Georgia, an unsuspecting teenager would find herself in a horrifying race against time, one she was never meant to win. Audrey McIntosh was savoring the final days of summer before her life changed forever. At 18, she had just graduated high school and was only weeks away from beginning her college journey. The last days before adulthood were slipping through her fingers, and she intended to enjoy every last moment. Her days were spent sleeping in, meeting up with friends, and soaking in the late summer warmth. Most of her high school classmates were moving on, some heading off to universities across the country, others choosing apprenticeships or gap years abroad. The group that had once been inseparable was now scattering to different corners of the world, and Audrey was making the most of the time she had left with them. The summer of 2011 was fun, but had created perfect conditions for snake activity in residential areas. Record-breaking temperatures averaging 5 degrees above normal, combined with unusual rainfall patterns, had driven copperheads from their traditional woodland habitats into suburban spaces. By August, Georgia's Wildlife Resources Division had recorded a 47% increase in snake sightings compared to previous years. Home gutters, with their shade and collected moisture, had become particularly attractive refuges for these heat-sensitive predators. At home, during the summer, her responsibilities were few. Her mother had given her only 2 tasks: keep the dishes clean and take care of the laundry. It was a simple routine, one Audrey didn't mind at all. Some afternoons, she even started dinner to make her mother's life a little easier. They lived on the outskirts of town, just a 10-minute drive from the city, in a quiet, picturesque home with no close neighbors, except for Mr. and Mrs. Hentley, an elderly couple who lived half a mile away on a small farm. Audrey adored them, often walking over with fresh strawberries from her family's garden just to sit and chat for an hour or two. Of all the people she'd be leaving when she moved away for college, she knew she would miss the Hentleys the most. It was a quiet, peaceful summer, until the morning when everything changed. On that fateful morning, Audrey woke earlier than usual, stirred from sleep by the sound of her parents' cars leaving the driveway. Unable to drift back to sleep, she decided to get a head start on the day. After a long shower, she loaded the washing machine and spent the next 40 minutes packing her dorm room boxes while she waited for the cycle to finish. By the time the sun had fully risen, the clothes were ready to be hung outside to dry. The McIntosh family never used a dryer during the summer. There was no need when the sun did the job just as well. Dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, Audrey stepped outside with her laundry basket. The morning was already warm and the cheerful chirping of birds filled the air. She glanced up at the house's chimney, where a pair of yellow warblers had perched, singing their morning tune. For a brief moment, she paused, watching them flit and flutter against the clear blue sky. In that same moment, her basket lightly knocked against the house's gutter. It was a soft, barely noticeable bump, something Audrey didn't even register. But something inside the gutter did. Coiled among the dried leaves, a copperhead had been resting, hidden away in the shaded crevice of the metal pipe. The vibration of the impact startled it, making it shift uncomfortably. It remained still at first, reluctant to move, but now it was alert, its body tensed, its tongue flicking as it tasted the air. Copperheads are masters of concealment in human environments. Their distinctive hourglass pattern, which stands out in photographs, becomes nearly invisible against decomposing leaves and metal oxidation. These snakes can remain motionless for up to 72 hours, conserving energy while waiting for prey. Their preferred temperature range of 78 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit matches exactly with the microclimate created by residential gutters. Most importantly, their strike response is triggered by vibration rather than visual stimuli, making accidental encounters particularly dangerous. Unaware of the hidden danger, Audrey turned back toward the clothesline, unintentionally knocking the gutter again. This time, the copperhead didn't hesitate. It struck. Faster than the blink of an eye, the snake lashed out, its fangs sinking deep into Audrey's bare calf, just above her right ankle. She gasped in shock, a sharp, searing pain spreading through her leg like wildfire. For a split second, she didn't even process what had happened, just that something had hit her, something bad. The copperhead retracted just as quickly as it had struck, disappearing back into its hiding place. But the damage was already done. The venom was injected. Audrey stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. Though she had only caught a glimpse of it, she knew what had bitten her. Every child in the South grew up with the same warning: beware of copperheads. She had seen their pictures in textbooks, she had heard stories of their painful bites, and now she was living it. Panic surged through her. She should have called for help. She should have grabbed her phone and dialed 911. She should have stayed still. But fear had taken hold of her mind, clouding her judgment. And instead of staying put, she did the worst possible thing. She ran. Instinct took over and Audrey bolted, heading toward the only place she could think of, the Hentleys. The elderly couple's farmhouse was just a half a mile away. It felt like the safest place, the closest place. And in her panic, she believed if she could just get there, she would be okay. But every step she took was making things worse. Audrey's sprint across the field accelerated the venom spread exponentially. Each step increased her heart rate, pushing the toxins deeper into her system. At a running pace, blood circulation increases by 400%. Her heartbeat pounded like a war drum, accelerating the speed of venom through her bloodstream. The hemotoxins were already at work, attacking her red blood cells, destroying the tissue in her leg. She could feel it, spreading, burning, eating through her calf. Halfway through the open field, she was sobbing. 3/4 of the way, her vision started to blur. Her limbs felt like lead. By the time she reached the Henleys' driveway, she barely had the strength to stand. Mr. Henley, watering his garden, turned just in time to see Audrey stumble toward him. Her face was pale, drenched in sweat. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead collapsed to the ground, vomiting violently. The old man rushed to her side, shouting for his wife. Audrey's body convulsed, her bitten legs stretched out in an unnatural angle. The venom had already begun shutting down her nervous system. Somewhere in the midst of her pain and delirium, she managed to choke out the words, "Copperhead." Mr. Henley's heart sank. He looked down at her leg and saw the bite marks. The skin around them had already turned black, the necrosis spreading fast. As the ambulance arrived, Audrey's convulsions worsened. Her body was shutting down, her organs failing. The paramedics rushed to stabilize her, but the venom had done its job too well. Within minutes of being loaded into the ambulance, Audrey lost consciousness. She never woke up again. Her death was a cruel twist of fate. Copperhead bites almost never kill, but a combination of dehydration, panic, and an undiagnosed heart condition turned a survivable bite into a lethal one. A week later, Mr. Henley returned to the McIntosh home. The laundry was still strewn across the yard. The house felt empty. But as he picked up the fallen clothes, his foot tapped against the gutter, and from inside he heard it. A low, angry hiss. The snake had never left. This time he was ready. With one swift movement, he dispatched the copperhead, ending the life of the creature that had taken Audrey's. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Audrey McIntosh's demise was fueled by fear, a sprint for safety that sealed her fate before she even reached help. But the next story is something different altogether. This wasn't just about an individual's final moments, but about an entire police department walking into something straight out of a nightmare. In March 2023, Beaver County, Pennsylvania would witness an incident so bizarre, so unexpected, that it would be talked about for decades. It was a case so unsettling that it became a cautionary tale for rookie officers, a lesson that any seemingly routine day could spiral into chaos in an instant. By 2023, America's exotic reptile trade had become a multi-million-dollar industry operating in legal gray areas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated over 500,000 venomous snakes were kept in private collections nationwide, with only 30% properly permitted. Pennsylvania alone had recorded 127 incidents involving illegal reptiles in the previous year, though experts believe this represented less than 10% of actual cases. The average black mamba could fetch $15,000 on the black market, while rare color morphs of venomous species could sell for upwards of $50,000. When 911 dispatch received a call about an unresponsive man inside a quiet suburban home, they assumed the worst: a heart attack, an overdose, perhaps even a crime of passion. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where children played on their front lawns and neighbors greeted each other on their morning walks. There was no reason to believe anything out of the ordinary had taken place inside the house. But when first responders stepped through the front door, they walked straight into a scene that no amount of training could have prepared them for. The house belonged to 23-year-old Joshua Riggs, who lived there with his longtime girlfriend Jenny and her 3-year-old daughter Maya. Their home wasn't large, just a modest 3-bedroom space that was at the time being shared with Joshua's cousin Morris and his wife Diane. Morris and Diane had moved in only 3 months earlier, arriving from Missouri for one very specific reason: business. But it wasn't drugs, stolen goods, or illegal weapons they were dealing in. Their trade was alive. Joshua and Morris were well known within the reptile community. They weren't just hobbyists, they were specialists. Licensed dealers of exotic reptiles, they imported and sold snakes, lizards, and even the occasional crocodile to private collectors and reptile enthusiasts. Their reputations were solid, they were respected, and for the most part their business was entirely legal. Well, sort of. Professional reptile facilities operate under strict guidelines. Temperature must be maintained between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity levels of 60 to 80%, requiring sophisticated climate control systems costing upwards of $30,000. Safety protocols mandate double-locked enclosures, backup power systems, and bite protocols posted every 10 feet. Most importantly, venomous snake rooms must have sealed doors, emergency anti-venom storage, and pressure-monitored ventilation, none of which are possible in typical residential construction. While they had the necessary licensing to import and sell exotic animals, keeping them inside a residential home was another matter entirely. Back in Missouri, they had used a dedicated warehouse for housing their inventory, but the recent move had drained their finances. So, for the time being, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a 3-bedroom house filled with nearly 200 snakes and reptiles. If that wasn't shocking enough, about 70% of them were venomous. Cobras, rattlesnakes, mambas, even a crocodile, all living inside the same home as a toddler. To Joshua and Morris, this wasn't insanity, it was just temporary. They planned to move the animals into a proper facility once they regained their financial footing. But as police officers stepped into the house on that fateful March day, none of that mattered, because lying on the living room floor was Joshua Riggs, and he was very, very dead. The air inside the house was thick and humid, made worse by the heat lamps and temperature regulators keeping the reptiles comfortable. Every wall, every corner, every available space was occupied by something: snakes, lizards, tanks filled with creatures that stared unblinking at the unexpected intruders. One of the paramedics, already unnerved by the sheer number of venomous animals in the room, made the mistake of looking toward the kitchen. There, strapped into her high chair, was little Maya, calmly eating her breakfast, completely unfazed by the presence of first responders. Sitting inches away from her, curled inside its locked glass enclosure, was a boomslang, one of the deadliest snakes in the world. The African boomslang represents one of herpetology's most lethal mysteries. Their venom, a potent hemotoxin, causes death by internal hemorrhaging, with mortality rates reaching 100% if antivenom isn't administered within 8 hours. Unlike cobras or vipers, boomslangs can open their jaws 170 degrees when striking, and their rear-fanged delivery system makes them especially dangerous. The snake that sat near Maya's high chair could deliver enough venom to kill 12 adults, a fact that would later horrify investigating officers. The sight of the child next to the bright green, highly venomous serpent was too much for one of the paramedics. He turned and promptly vomited onto the carpet. Meanwhile, the other medic moved toward Joshua's body. He was motionless, his skin pale, his wrist bearing 2 small puncture wounds. The conclusion seemed obvious. He had been bitten. But something wasn't right. The wound was at least a week old, and Joshua's body wasn't showing signs of venom-induced death. As the house was secured and a medical examiner arrived, it was confirmed Joshua Riggs hadn't died from a snake bite. The cause of death was natural, a freak medical condition that, for reasons never fully disclosed, had claimed his life. But in some ways, that only made the situation more complicated, because now authorities had a far bigger problem on their hands. With Joshua gone, the police were left with a critical question: what do we do with all these animals? By Pennsylvania law, owning venomous reptiles was legal, but keeping them inside a residential home was not. However, Joshua and Morris had taken extreme precautions to ensure safety. Every single cage was equipped with a key lock mechanism. Every venomous creature was housed in a reinforced enclosure. The entire home had security cameras monitoring the animals 24/7 in case of accidental escapes. Had this been a reptile farm or a professional facility, they would have passed an inspection easily. Even Child Protective Services struggled to find legal grounds to intervene. Technically, Maya wasn't in danger. There were no recorded escapes, no safety violations regarding her care. She was healthy, well-fed, and deeply loved by her family. The only real legal issue was the location of the animals. A judge reviewed the case and made a final ruling. Over 100 non-venomous reptiles were allowed to remain in the home, including a 5-foot python. Another 100 venomous creatures were confiscated, including 2 black mambas, one of the most feared and aggressive snakes on the planet, multiple cobras and rattlesnakes, a dwarf crocodile. All confiscated animals were relocated to licensed reptile rescue centers and zoos across the country. Morris and Jenny, both stakeholders in the business, were fined $1,000 per animal removed, resulting in a staggering $100,000 fine. It was a harsh ruling, but considering the sheer number of creatures they had inside their home and the fact that a 3-year-old child lived among them, the judge had no leniency to spare. To make matters worse, the state had to launch a full-scale neighborhood sweep, deploying dozens of wildlife officers to search for any escaped serpents. For days, teams scoured backyards, storm drains, and wooded areas, ensuring no venomous creatures had slithered into unsuspecting residents' homes. They never found a single escapee, because despite how horrifying the setup seemed to outsiders, Joshua and Morris had actually run a tight, disciplined operation. Had Joshua not died, the animals would have soon been moved to their proper facility, and this entire nightmare would have never happened. But fate had other plans, and so the reptile empire they had spent years building was dismantled in an instant. Despite the official ruling of natural causes, there are those who still wonder. Joshua's puncture wound, the venomous creatures he handled daily, the sheer coincidence of his sudden, unexplained death. It all seemed too strange. Some whispered theories that he had been bitten, but that the authorities wanted to avoid a public panic. Others believed it was something else entirely, an allergic reaction, an undiagnosed condition, or something far more sinister. But the truth is, no one will ever know what really happened in that house. Only that on a quiet street in Beaver County, a man died among hundreds of fanged, slithering creatures, leaving behind a family that loved him, a business that crumbled overnight, and a legacy that would forever be remembered in the annals of snake terrors. Thank you for watching. Snakes are fascinating, feared, and sometimes deadly. Whether it's an expert who trusted them too much, an unsuspecting girl who ran toward her own demise, or a man who lived among hundreds of the world's most venomous creatures, these stories prove one thing: nature doesn't play favorites. But this is just the beginning. Stay with us for our next video where we unravel the horrifying true story of a woman swallowed whole by a massive snake. Click over and we'll see you there.